Tony Blair Institute released a paper 2 days before the local elections. Blair has undermined the urgent need for climate action and has dismissed the credibility of net zero planning. And then I think in terms of investing in breakthrough energies, I would argue that's actually in line with Miliband. So who's right, Blair or Miliband? Civil war erupted this week in the Labour Party over net zero. Tony Blair Institute released a paper 2 days before the local elections saying the climate paradox, and essentially it's arguing that there is a role for fossil fuels and that the burdensome and the affordability of climate action has got way out of spec of what the electorate and voters want across the world community, and that basically the current government doing is going headlong into a solution that is not right for society. On this week's episode, we're going to look at the fallout on climate change and net zero from what happened. We're going to then look at actually what's the climate paradox actually talk about in the papers. We're also then going to look at who's more right, Blair or Miliband, as these two go ideologically head to head from the same camp, both big Labour politicians. And finally, we're going to look at what does Labour do next after this fallout? Because unlike the Tony Blair Institute, they do have to run a country and run our policies. Sit back, relax and enjoy. Also, this is a very significant week in British history. On the 8th of May will mark 80 years since Victory in Europe Day, when those who had so little gave up so much for ourselves. We'd like to take the opportunity to thank our armed forces, thank their families, and also to thank those people that are still serving us today to provide freedom across Europe. The Wolfe Power Club is being sponsored by AIM Recruit, so if you've got any needs for drivers or logistics staff, please contact AIM Recruit in our show notes, but also you can meet them this week at the 14th of May at the UKIFTA conference. And as we say now in the Wolfe Power Club, run with the pack, give them a call and book your driver needs and logistics staff. So before British Weather defeated this recording, what did we say? We said there's going to be 4 things we need to look at this week. The fallout of the Civil War, what's actually occurred. Secondly, we're going to look at actually the climate paradox and look at the detail of what their report says and see where the potential market is. We're then going to look at is Blair or is Miliband right? And then finally, we're going to look at what's next for the Labour government as a result of this and next for net zero. So let's go into it. What happened on the fallout? So the trigger was this report comes out 2 days before the local elections, where those outside the UK, basically about a quarter of the UK's local councillors, who are the people who fix the roads, schools, and it's the entry level of politics, were up for election. Labour had nearly 300 seats to protect. And then what happened was they actually lost 65% of their seats, and it was 186 councillors. The other thing that happened on the same night, there was an election for the representative of Runcorn. Now, basically what happened in Runcorn was that it was the 16th safest seat for a Member of Parliament in the UK in terms of majority, over 15,000 for Labour, and Labour actually lost that seat. Now, they got a very similar vote share to Reform, Nigel Farage's party, but Nigel Farage's party won by 6 votes. Yeah, 6 individual people was the swing that took the seat, one of the closest election results in history, and as a result, shockwaves are sent in that questions about what's actually going to happen at Labour at a general election, with votes coming in on the council side and the seat side. Then the following day, there was various media shows across the UK, and energy was one of the big reasons that the Labour government have lost significant support since the summer. And there was a number of areas. The first was that the winter fuel allowance, which helped the elderly, disabled and so on have a contribution towards their heating bills, has gone in terms of the budget cuts from the government, increasing the cost on people's fuel charges. Secondly is the government's committed billions of pounds into GB energy, carbon capture and other projects that essentially people feel that are Ed Miliband projects, and they're not supporting the British economy, British jobs, and they feel that essentially these comments from Blair added further, and there's people calling in phone-ins talking about the winter fuel allowance and the waste of money that net zero could be. And as a result, it looks like this is an issue that's not going to go away for the government, with lots of people challenging what they've said and essentially feel that their policy at the moment is not in the best interest for the United Kingdom. There was also some fallout for Tony Blair, so it wasn't that everyone was like, this is brilliant, this is amazing, this should be celebrated. There was further fallout for Tony Blair. So some of the fallout that Tony Blair got was the following. So David King, who was the Chief Scientific Officer under Blair when he was Prime Minister and of Tony Brown as Prime Minister, he basically said the following. Blair has undermined the urgent need for climate action and has dismissed the credibility of net zero planning. The next person to wade in that was under Blair's regime was Lord Nicholas Stern, and the Stern Review of 2006 in Britain was the big report that highlighted that actually the need to spend on climate change was going to be cheaper than taking no action on climate change. And what basically he has said is that this report is muddled and misleading. It misrepresents the global actions that are taking place, and China is a leading world producer of domestic renewables and electric vehicles. So basically they are challenging this idea, and then Stern concluded with the fact that the point here is net zero is not just a Western ideal. And this is basically what essentially you've seen on those people who work very close to Blair. They don't really understand why he's made this move away. The other fallout that has been as well is that there has been some comment as well of what happened. So apparently when the report came out from the Tony Blair Institute, Downing Street felt totally blindsided. They did not know this publication was coming. So you have to feel, we'll go into this a bit later on, was this about creating most impact for the report and great publicity and UK-wide media coverage and worldwide coverage? We have to say that they probably would not have featured on this podcast in normal circumstances, so it has worked in many ways. Then Keir Starmer has publicly come out and backed Ed Miliband, and it looks like he's trying to distance himself from a Blair era of narrative and the Tony Blair Institute, even though there's key members of Keir's team which are with Blair links, such as Peter Mandelson as his diplomat to the USA between Britain and ourselves and one of our main partners. Then there's also been some backbench MPs, such as a Labour backbench MP, Nadia Whitome, and she's dismissed it due to the fact that the Blair in previous times and the Institute get funding from fossil fuel industry and fossil fuel countries. What we would say on the Wolfe Power Club is that's not a reason to dismiss opinions. There's lots of thought leaders, energy thinkers and big companies in the major space that are doing wonderful things on transition, and therefore you can't just say because they're getting money from fossil fuels the view's dismissed. But I understand why these backbench MPs are trying to bring up a conflict of interest. It was played down a bit by the Environment Secretary Steve Reed, who struck a conciliatory note by saying, Blair's comments were a valid and important contribution. Now, Unite bosses responded to Blair's report with criticism of Labour's current approach to net zero, feeling it's threatening jobs in the North Sea, and the messaging should remain to put pressure on this point. So as you can see, it has created lots of fallout in the Civil War, this debate. We then go further and look at essentially the second area of it. And what did the climax paradox say? And we'll dive into this. There's a link in the show notes so you can make your own thoughts on it. But this is essentially what the paradox said. So the 1600 words that came out on the 29th of April, the climax paradox, why we need to reset action on climate change, was there to strike up a chords around sort of 7 different areas. But the foreword from Blair was basically saying, look, we feel that actually what the approach is wrong is that the world is demanding more and more fossil fuels. It then links to that 2024 infrastructure of a 95 gigawatt new fire-powered coal station in China, and also India hitting 1 billion tonnes of coal in production in a single year. It also then talks about the massive rise in aviation need. If you go back to one of our previous podcasts on the sustainable aviation. We also agree with that 2050 prediction of air traveling. And it talks about the global emissions from China, India and Southeast Asia, that essentially the flows of renewable energy developing have not helped in the past few years. And then the report goes to show sort of peak fossil fuel uses and the growing of nature base. Talks about how planning has been a massive problem, how financing has been a massive problem, and AI funding has been a huge challenge. Then essentially these are the main areas of the report. And basically there's 7 main areas. And the 7 main areas are accelerating and scaling technologies that capture carbon, harnessing of the technology including AI, investing in the breakthrough and frontier energy solutions, scaling nature-based solutions, adaptation to what is coming, and simplifying the global effects to deliver collective action, and rethinking of the financing, including philanthropy. I think at this point we will skip to some words that Blair said once upon a time at COP, and essentially we'll come back to them point 6.
But I was involved in the very first treaty, the Kyoto Treaty, back in 1997, 98. And, back then it was all about trying to persuade people that climate change was a problem. And so for, I would say, the best part of 2 decades, the argument was, no, it really is a problem. And people were saying, well, we're not sure, or there's some people denying it. But actually, I think now everyone accepts as a problem. The question is, what's the solution that's going to work? So this is the challenge. You've got finance and then you've got technology, which is the other big challenge.
So, simplifying global efforts. Tony Blair, obviously, she's here there. It was at COP29. He's been at multiple COPs. He was at Paris, and obviously he was part of the Kyoto Accords when they happened in the late 90s. And I think what they're basically saying is that there's essentially China and India are sitting outside the core. The reason why that's a conflict with Miliband is that Miliband is trying ever so hard to get close to China on the solar space and the renewable space, and there's been multiple visits and multiple meetups and multiple events between Miliband and his Chinese equivalents over the last few years. There's some bits that I think are kind of non-confrontational in this report are the idea of AI investment, the point 2, in that as a former director of energy and AI company, that's already happening. Projects either are launching, have been launched, and further money's going into that. And I think everyone feels that running a smart grid with the best technology will save huge power. So I don't think anyone disagrees with that, either Miliband or Blair. I think the technologies to capture carbon, where there is a disagreement with Miliband, is that Miliband is looking for areas where essentially we can reduce our total carbon usage. And my indication is the ethos of the Tony Blair Institute report is that essentially they are saying that our usage isn't reducing. So actually, rather than trying to convince people to reduce usage, we need carbon capture storage to help those industries carry on, such as fossil fuels, where you might not be able to offset. And then I think in terms of investing in breakthrough energies, I would argue that's actually in line with Miliband. Like Miliband with GB Energy sees a way there to do scale of jobs and energy. So I almost kind of think point 3 is in alignment. And then in terms of the idea of adapting what's coming in terms of flood defences and so on, I think that's probably an overall criticism of European governments, because it looks like with events that have happened across Western Europe, with power systems down, massive floods, that the domestic spending and cuts there have led to really bad security of supply issues, and keeping people safe is not being achieved at the moment by those governments. I think though the big difference though is point 7. It's the rethinking of financing, including philanthropy. And why is this such a controversial issue? And I think this is one of the heart of the problems of where they see a difference on net zero coming Burton. At this moment of time, both the electorate and now a former senior politician in terms of Britain's most successful ever general election prime minister in terms of Tony Blair, are basically saying the public are not seeing the benefit from net zero, and this continued thing of diverting resources, hitting their cost bases, is not going to be a success. And what we are hearing, therefore, is that they're saying that actions aren't changing, and therefore what we've got to do is have a longer transition so that there's a longer role for fossil fuels. And I think a lot of the British business community would support that. When you see the slow take up of electric trucks, when you see the low margins being paid for alternative fuels, then you go up to the upstream end, you see the taxation from Miliband's government, where basically like the position of Labour is tax fossil fuel very hard to get net zero going. And basically I think what Blair's trying to say is that actually you need these people in the energy mix, and therefore the only solution is that there is a smoother transition. Whereas what we have seen is that essentially in the past 9 months since the Labour government been, multiple changes in the North Sea. Since the levy has gone up, we've seen the likes of Apache declare they're leaving, Shell and Equinor leaving and forming a joint company, Harbour reducing investment, huge criticisms from the likes of Serica. So essentially I think what we're seeing is this vast change. The other thing on funding and financing is that I think what the basic Tony Blair Institute alluded to is something the podcast's been covering for a while, is that energy companies don't want to be the people that fund energy transition. The voter doesn't want to fund energy transition. So I think basically what the implication is that when you're looking at the different taxations and philanthropy, is that essentially for net zero to get back on track, there needs to be an attractive taxation system that probably hasn't been coming, is not stable, and is not there. And this is the big, I would say, fight, is that not that so much that Blair doesn't believe in net zero, he doesn't believe in it at any cost, and that the major energy companies and countries should be able to provide it. So that's what we see in the So who's right, Blair or Miliband? I kind of actually feel a little bit for Miliband. Lots of things I don't like, and I've been very vocal on that on this podcast. But I do think that with human behaviours, it's very hard to get people to change to in any circumstances, let alone their energy supply. I think, though, there's two areas that I feel that Miliband needs to review following this criticism from Blair and the election results. The first is that I think that needs reviewing is that essentially that link by telling people they're going to get cheaper energy, I just don't see that. And the reason I don't see that is that ultimately there's no link between cheaper energy per se and cutting out the need for the likes of coal and so on. You know, coal is still one of the cheapest ways to energise the planet, even if it has a massive economic impact later on. In terms of the cost to serve, I think trying to link that you're going to save £300 by 2030 while you're taking away winter fuel allowance, I just don't see that bringing credibility with the public. I think what he's got to do is a hearts and minds battle. And what you don't hear is people ring up radio stations saying, we're not spending enough. We're spending too much money, on the NHS. They say the complete opposite. They're always asking governments to spend more on the health system. And I think where the Blair report is right in terms of, philanthropy, spending, we need to somehow develop the public and politicians that essentially it is good to essentially spend on those commitments and go forward, and essentially there is a value add to society. I don't think that's shown at the moment, and it's not breaking through. The other thing is, I think where Miliband is in difficulty is the influence that Tony Blair has, and I'll just go for it. Not only did he win 3 general elections, whereas when Miliband was leader, he lost significantly, and it's 10 years since the famous carved stone, and I heard a lovely little bit of dialogue from some of the aides in the car that when they saw the pledges on stone, apparently Miliband said, guys, that looks like a gravestone, what we're doing, and then one of his team was like, wait, we'll put some balloons on it, it'll look fine then. And needless to say, 10 years on, it's still one of the most iconic images of the 2015 election. I can't believe that was 10 years ago, but the stone lives on. And whereas Blair won 3 elections. So I think when you've got MPs with small majorities worried about their seats coming up to election time, they will be listening to the ear of people like the Tony Blair Institute and Blair, various supporters, because they're one of the few Labour machines that won multiple elections, and Keir Starmer has yet to prove that they'll be able to defend their position and people be able to defend their jobs in Parliament. So I think that is one of the key things. The other thing to think about with the Blair Institute, which essentially was a criticism but actually also shows me the influence, is that you look at the experts within the Tony Blair Institute, and essentially they've got some big hitters across worldwide connections with huge influences in multiple regions. So you've got Sir General Nick Carter, who was a former UK Chief of Defence, but essentially who'll have a lot of the defence and governments around the world talking to the 900 staff at the Tony Blair Institute for insight and expert. He's also signed a couple of former Prime Ministers. So he's got Sanna Marin, the former Finnish Prime Minister, and he also has Matteo Renzi, the former Italian Prime Minister. And there's a bit of a joke that the Tony Blair Institute is the McKinsey for former prime ministers. But what it means is in lots of political systems across those 40 countries in the world, this opinion about evolving net zero and net zero policy isn't going anywhere anytime soon, and essentially there is going to be massive feedback into those areas. And I think where it will put pressure on Miliband is either future COPs or future international agreements, is how do we get this factor of cost addressed, and is there something that governments can do with bonds? Is there something they can do with sponsorship? Because it seems that there is a real struggle. And where I'd also say, though, that Miliband shouldn't step down on his belief about going to renewable energy and about nuclear systems. What I think is very fair, though, is our good friends at the OUK showing that there's 200,000 jobs in the UK based in the North Sea. There's multiple industries that still need, like steel, good value electricity. And while we're in that transition stage, there needs to be that thought about timeframes, because in business it's timeframes and cost to serve, which may or may not growth happen. And I think that essentially there needs to be an idea that we keep the gas and oil and fossil resources powering industries, but we work to a point where we use technology to replace them with essentially affordable and better than we've got today, not just on the environment but on all factors, renewable resources. So where does that leave us? What next for the Labour government? I think that Starmer will back Miliband. I think that the last thing that Starmer actually should do is flip-flop on this policy, because this is one of their legacy statements. And if they start flip-flopping on that, it brings everything into play with no real game. They do have a significant 4-year period before the general election, and essentially if they can deliver legacy on new energy infrastructure, that would be good. The problem they've got is that the various big inputs of financial funding are not coming forward to the party, and the government haven't put a set of tax regimes in place to support it. One of the points in the Tony Blair Institute report was about these ideas of forestation, farmland. Well, if you suddenly there's taxation on your farms, where's the incentive of people to put forest and to put offset in this country? The other reality is that majors are now pulling back their investment and income on what's happening out there. So, in our conclusion on this Labour civil war, it once again highlights that there's not universal opinion on net zero, and that essentially multiple countries around the world are essentially questioning the timeframes and what they spend on it. I think the other thing, though, we got to say is that I was surprised that they blindsided the government by announcing it 2 days before the local election. But as you can see, the reality is that the Tony Blair Institute wouldn't be on this podcast or all across national media without having done this move. So they have definitely done it. And although they're not for profit, they've obviously done it to have most impact of their report. And they've certainly achieved that with their 1,600 words. You please comment in the discussions about how you feel about it, and I look forward to more opinions and more comments, and it'd be great to see some of you in Leeds on the 14th of May at our live podcast. Thank you for your indulgence, ladies and gentlemen.